Well, we'll get started here in just a minute. Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm sure a few more folks are going to join us. I know we had around between 30 and 40 folks registered today. So this is Lori Grassgreen from the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And some of you I know have been regulars to our Brown Bag Lunch series. And we get folks calling in from all across the state, all kinds of organizations, and it's really excited. We've had around 8 to 10 of them now, and we have 2 more coming up. There's one in October, and that's going to be the Pathways to Prevention Statewide Steering Committee, talking about the work that they're doing in Alaska, developing tools for conversation and change. And then the last one for this year will be in November, and that'll be Linda Chamberlain, who will talk a little bit about intergenerational violence and thinking about that for planning for prevention. So I just wanted to let folks know all of these series are recorded, and so if you're interested in hearing the recordings or sharing this recording, you can go to one of the locations is on the ANDVSA website, and you can see the link there. You can access the recordings for these previous web conferences. So if folks are interested, just visit the ANDVSA website and find those recordings. So thanks so much to everyone for joining, and especially I want to thank Cole for joining us today and talking about this really important topic of rethinking gender and how that plays into health and safety. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Cole, and let you walk us through this. And folks, before we get started, please don't put us on hold. That's one thing we ask, is because we don't like to get the music for that. And if you're not talking, put yourself on mute if there's any background noise. And there'll be some opportunities to fill out the polls online. And yeah, take it away, Cole. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to join you all today and to hear, both be able to share a little bit about the work that I've been doing around the country, and also hear more about the work you all are doing, and answer questions and have a good conversation. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I think in a lot of ways my work in the gender justice field really started with work and organizing that I had done around domestic violence. So I'm excited in a lot of ways. It's kind of like coming home to be able to talk about that work. I'll tell you just a bit about my background so that you've got that info, and then we'll go ahead and jump into our first poll. So for me, I've been working in this field for about 20 years at this point, and it really started when I became active and involved in the violence prevention movement in California. One of my first jobs was working in an overnight shelter, and that led to me becoming the director of community engagement and outreach. And so it's been really exciting to see a lot of the domestic violence movement shift some of its thinking around just moving from kind of responding to crises and also developing our capacity to also do really amazing prevention work in our communities too. I think that the gender work is really something that a lot of people know impacts the work, but not necessarily something that we give a lot of thought to, how to use gender as a resource and a tool in challenging not only gender norms, but also really reducing violence. So I'm excited to have a little bit of time to talk about that with you today. And in terms of just the background, I went to school in the Bay Area at Mills College, and also studied abroad in England doing my master's degree there in gender research. And so certainly, as I think about this work, there's a lot of it that happens. The most powerful work that happens on the ground and in communities, like all of the communities you all come from. So with that, I'd love to get a sense of who's on the call and where you're calling in from. So we can start with our first poll, and if you can share where you're calling in from, that would be awesome, just so that we can get a sense.
Hi, we can go first. This is Kristen and Afton, and we're in Ketchikan, and we are sitting here at an outreach facility in Women in Safe Homes.
Awesome.
Great. And then are you online there, Afton, too?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Oh, I missed that. Sorry.
No, totally fine.
Yeah. And
we've got quite a few folks who are responding to the poll, which is awesome. Welcome to folks that are joining us.
yeah, so if anyone else wants to online there, you can see that you should be able to see the poll on your screen and fill in the answer and hit submit. And it looks like we have some different locations there.
Great.
Nice.
So it looks like we've got thick cut in the house. Lots of folks from Juneau, Homer, Alaska, with lots of exclamation marks. I love it. Ketchikan, Anchorage, the Dillingham Public Health Center is also on, as well as the Craig Public Health Center. Evans Phillips, the public health nurse, and also in Craig, Kodiak. That's pretty good.
And in the Matsu area in Wasilla.
Awesome. Did I catch everybody?
And Atlanta.
Huh. Fabulous. Well, I know that there is a range of just diversity of the issues that folks are looking at and face as they are part of this work, and we'll have a chance during the conversation to really talk very specifically about some of the communities that you all are working in. Thanks for taking the poll. So where I wanted to start is just a little bit of a historical perspective on kind of how gender has been historically at the heart of the DV movement and its launch and its incubation, and then talk a little bit about why reframing the conversation on gender is important, why it can be helpful. I think in particular we're seeing a lot of work, certainly in Alaska and around the country, of young people really picking up and really wanting a new conversation on gender as a way to solve lots of problems. And so it's exciting to think about how that's happening and ways that you all are building that conversation across Alaska. And then part of the way that that I've thought about my work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, is how do we look to the margins of the work that is often kind of outside of the spotlight as being a really incredible place for finding innovation and resourcing it and sharing and borrowing from each other so that we're all really implementing best practices as part of the work. So we have another poll. I'm very excited. This is like the largest number of polls I've put in. There are like 4 into the PowerPoint. But I'd love to get a sense of just what range of time and experience and wisdom we have on the call. So if you can input in, have you been working in the DV or the health field for less than 3 years, 4 to 7 years, or more than 7 years, then we can get a sense of where folks are at in terms of the breakdown of the call. And then hopefully it should show us, because this one is a multiple choice, it'll show all of us the answer in just a minute.
Hey. Thank you.
very much.
All right, let's see our results. So a good range with definitely folks with a lot of expertise and newer folks to the field on the call. That's great. So I'll make sure that also helps me to just make sure that I, in terms of the range of information, and I'm covering both. So when we think about kind of the legacy that has brought us here, the violence and gender are deeply interwoven, and I'm sure that many of you know how disproportionate impacts of violence against women are such a large part of why the domestic violence movement has grown to do the work that is happening. You know, much of the kind of traditional framework and the launch of the DV movement was in part sparked in St. Paul. And a lot of the early shelters held what were called consciousness raising circles, where they really talked with women about the impact of violence and how often gender-based it was, and that there was a lot of work that needed to happen in our community and our culture to shift people's perceptions of women in a way that actually helps us to move the movement forward. And I think that the silos that often tend to happen, so with a lot of the agencies and organizations that I've worked with, there tends to be silos in the movement where sexual assault will often be in different organizations or housed separately from domestic violence organizations, and then organizations that are doing kind of women's empowerment and leadership or working on LGBT issues often tend to be working on their own and not interconnected and not working with each other. And I think that that's part of what's exciting about the new conversation on gender, is that it really is a space and a place for all of us to come together and think about how we can fuse our resources and gifts to be able to really shape the conversation on gender. In a lot of ways, I think that gender is the most fixed and concrete box of our identity. And so I'd love to ask each of you to think back to one of your earliest memories of gender. It doesn't have to be your very first, but think about a time when you were clearly told that you could or could not do something based on your gender. I'll give everybody a second to think back. And then think about how old you were when that happened. And then you'll see on the slide an opportunity for you to put in just how old were you when that happened. When you had that experience that you can remember where someone really told you, oh, well, you can do this or you can't do this, and it was really a result of your gender.
And the one that just popped up in my head. Playing soccer with boys. I could play on boys.
So the folks are filling out the polls. And it's just fascinating how early some of these experiences happen. Most of them happen, it looks like really clearly, under 10. And a lot of them are between 0 and 5. When we begin to learn the expectations of gender all around us and the pressure really that comes with it. And as we think about how often these conversations around gender really shape how we see ourselves and how we see the world. And I just wanted to see if there's anyone who wanted to share. You don't have to share your experience, but just thinking about how your experience has helped shape the way you see gender.
I have us on mute, but if you want to speak or something, you tell me and I'll unmute us. But you might need to eat your food.
Let me eat this.
think that there's someone there, but not planning to speak.
I think that's Ati talking to the group she's with.
Awesome.
I thought I was on mute.
No, you're not.
Now you are. Cool.
Good to hear you laugh, Ati.
Anyone want to share?
Hi, this is Deb from Wasilla. I'm a product of the 50s. I was a little girl in the 50s, and so my first introduction of how little girls act was probably around 5 years old, prior to going to school, where I was told, well, that's not how young ladies act. Young ladies act and dress a certain way, and that was my indoctrination into being a girl. Girls did not play ball or spit or have what I thought was a greater fun than what I was doing, which I could do hopscotch and jump rope and play with my dolls. But girls acted and dressed in a certain way in the 50s, and that was my introduction.
Thanks so much. I think that reflects a lot of people's experiences around there are a lot of expectations that are really restrictive of all of us, but in particular there are a lot of expectations around girls and how they should be dressed and how they should act and all of those things during the window. And anyone else want to share? There's time for one more.
Hi, this is Tara in Homer, and I don't remember my parents ever saying that I couldn't or couldn't do something because of my gender, but I do remember being like 6 or 7 and wanting to play with a group of boys and being told I couldn't because I was a girl.
So that pressure, thanks. I think that's so telling that we get pressure from, sometimes it comes from our parents, sometimes it comes from our peers, sometimes it comes from teachers or other adults we respect. Sometimes it comes from our community spaces like church, school, that there are lots of different places we get messages, and sometimes they're competing and conflicting, and they absolutely tell us what we can wear, who we can hang out with, what kinds of things we're allowed to be interested in or we should be interested in, what kind of careers we can pursue, and that this pressure is out there and ever kind of pushing at us from all of these directions, and that it starts really, really young. Typically, research shows that by the time a child is 9, their understanding of gender mirrors and matches their parents. So by the time we, as young as 9 years old, we have a pretty fixed understanding of gender, and it really reflects our parents' worldview. And so for young people across our communities, they are deeply shaped by these gender norms, and a lot of times they aren't the healthiest of gendered norms, just in terms of the expectations and the pressures that our young people are living in and that we grow up in as adults. I think that as this work grows, so I've had the opportunity to work in LGBT communities, and for folks on the call, LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities. And a lot of times we think about the transgender community and their gender identity and them having made decisions about who they are. But really, all of us have a gender journey that starts when we decide how much of the pressure are we going to live up to and how much of the pressure are we going to live in. And, it comes down to, are you going to be the kind of girl that your mother expects you to be, or that your father expects you to be, that your friends expect you to be, or your partner expects you to be? And that a lot of us make decisions about what feels authentic to who we are. And usually the younger we are, the more we feel the pressure. And that as time goes on, we hopefully have more space to live on our own terms and to live in a way that feels more authentic. But I think that it's a lot of these gender norms that really contribute to a lot of the violence that we see in our communities. And the work that I've been doing most recently is actually with an organization called the Brown Boi Project. And so the Brown Boi Project, BOI, brings together young people around for whom masculinity is core to their identity. So they bring together young men, but they also bring together young LGBT people who also identify as masculine. And they're working on issues of privilege, and they've recently launched a program in a middle school. And what's fascinating about middle school is that they're working with 7th and 8th grade boys, which is definitely very brave, an undertaking. And I think that the way that we talked about gender and built out their framework is that between 5th and 8th grade is when everybody's going through puberty, and gender is kind of such a huge piece of the equation. And young men have a lot of pressure to perform physically, so they become really invested in being good at sports or pretending they are in this age because they know that that's something that's cool and that's expected of them. They also begin to talk sexually about sexual conquest and power, and whether they are or they aren't sexually active, they give the impression that they're players and that they're really good at pursuing young women as part of the pressure around masculinity. And then similarly, they tend to drift away from academic achievement and enrichment. And it's these early things that we often say, oh, well, boys will be boys, but these are the same kind of thinking. It's the same thinking and frameworks that contribute to the disproportionate incidences of rape and violence that we see, because we create a culture for young men that they grow up in as men in which it's actually really permissible to chase and pursue women that aren't interested in you, because that's how you show that you are really a true man in our culture and our society. Similarly, young women at this time are really discouraged from excelling academically, and they're also really, really encouraged to think of themselves at this point as sexual objects, and that this is the time that they should begin to be really interested in being pursued by boys. And all of that creates, for anyone who spent time with 7th and 8th graders, a real pressure cooker around identity and sexuality in their bodies, and they're trying to figure out what's happening. But I think we don't often think of it as the beginning of a culture in which violence is really permissible and okay with boys, and that while we don't encourage that violence to be directed at girls, that we do encourage them to see girls as objects and to sexually pursue them, and that combined with the fact that we really encourage boys to be physical and violent, and that's accepted in our culture, leads to trouble down the road. So I think that what's exciting to me about this work is that there are, as you all well know, that there's so many challenges that are faced, and as we think about kind of breaking down gender as a tool and a resource, that there's tons of work that's happening around the country where people are really saying, hey, wait a minute, we could go to 5 different cities and ask people, well, what makes a man and what makes a woman? And they would give us almost the same list of some things that are stereotypically seen as male or female or masculine and feminine, but really are personality traits that anybody should be able to embody. And that when we begin to break down some of these norms and expectations around gender, what we have are people who live more authentically themselves. They feel more comfortable in their own skin. And it starts to break down some of the negative stereotypes around masculinity that really make violence okay and cool and something that we've come to culturally not only be comfortable with, but in some ways expect from men in our society. And that when we do that, they're much less likely to engage in violence, whether it's intimate partner and dating violence in high school or physical violence with their peers and with their intimate partners. That by pushing these kind of conversations around gender, which a lot of the young people are actually already having, we really have an opportunity to open up a new conversation. So knowing that Alaska has such a disproportionate rate of, just being a lot of times under-resourced in this work and being in the top 5 nationally around violence, and also really thinking about the rates of violence that occur in Indigenous and in tribal communities. There's a huge opportunity to open up a conversation around gender as a way to get people talking about how we can shift and change these dynamics. I like to think of the idea of thriving versus surviving, and what does it mean? There was a movement in the 90s to shift the conversation from victims to survivors, and so I'm a big advocate of moving now from surviving to thriving, and what does that mean to build communities and cultures where people are healthy and whole, and that we have an opportunity to really push out the way that this work is happening. So the group that I mentioned, the Brown Boi Project, is working with about 40 organizations around the country to help them hold stronger and deeper conversations around gender. And I think that involves talking about LGBT issues. It means talking about masculinity, having circles for young men that are like healing and healthy and whole. It means doing all of this work that's kind of been in all of these different spaces, actually moving it into the same space. So I mentioned earlier that we want to build out the margins and where folks are at. That I'd love to hear from you, just kind of where do you feel like are the hidden gems and the resources in Alaska that don't actually get the attention or the resources they deserve, even though they're strategies that are really, really working?
Can you say the question one more time, Cole?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to hear from folks. What are the solutions or the strategies around gender that you think might be really working well, but they may not be widely practiced, or they may not have a lot of resources to actually execute them or make sure that they're happening across Alaska?
This is Colleen Watson and Craig, and I think that fathers that are doing a good job of role modeling and providing the guidance for their boys and girls aren't getting enough playtime. I don't think there's a picture out there that's given to the community to help people form a good, have a good idea of what would help our children to grow in a healthy way. And so I think that we could do some more publicity and forecasting about what a healthy gender role model is.
I love it. Thanks, Kathy. I think that the way that I talk about it with the organizations that I'm usually working with is that in order to create change, in particular when we don't have good models, is that we have to really encourage people to realize that what they're living in isn't actually the norm, that it isn't fixed, and that it could be changed. And then once they believe that where they're living and what they're living in could be changed, then we have to give them a sense of what that could look like. And those models that you're talking about of fathers being involved and engaged, of healthy relationships, and healthy ways to still embody masculinity and be in a good and healthy relationship with our partners and with our children is really key. And then once those two things happen, once you help folks to see that a different reality is possible, and then you give them a glimpse of what that reality could look like, that's actually when we see people begin to shift and start to seek out changes and be willing to make the shift behaviorally that will allow them to become the kind of person that they really wanted to all along, but they just didn't believe it was possible, and if it was, they didn't believe that they could do it. So I think that that's exactly it. What would it look like if there was some kind of social media campaign or a conversation across Alaska that was putting out alternative ways to think about fatherhood, and as you were saying, just kind of what it takes for young children to grow up healthy. That's awesome. Anyone else? Great. Okay, we'll keep moving. Fabulous. I think that the way that this conversation is happening in local communities is also what's really powerful about it, is that it's including a conversation around race. And I think that in a lot of communities, in a lot of places that I've worked with, people have been really nervous about talking about race. And when people do and really use cultural practices as part of the strategies, what people are finding is that it's actually really, really successful, and that building, it goes back to what Heather was just saying around modeling, that for the young people that we work with, for the adults that we work with, both in terms of the women that we work with and the men that we work with that are surviving and thriving, that really makes all of the difference in terms of being able to see themselves in a different place. So providing leadership that's rooted in communities of color, and at the same time also providing an opportunity for folks to really see and engage with tools and resources that come from their traditional history is really empowering, and something that I think is a real resource to a lot of the communities that we work with. And I guess just as we're thinking about why our communities need a new understanding of masculinity, that ultimately the power dynamics of around masculinity often end up being imbalanced. So there's a lot around masculinity as somebody. So I myself identify as masculine of center. I'm a queer person, and as someone who's socialized as a little girl, but grew up to be a masculine of center identified woman, there were times when I was younger where I was a target of violence because I was a girl. And then as I became masculine, there was a lot of encouragement by my peers, mainly, to really be a perpetrator of violence, whether it was interpersonal violence or emotional violence, that I was really encouraged to be abusive, even though I didn't identify as a man. And I think that for me what that highlights is just how much right now our understanding of masculinity is tied to really encouraging this notion that you have power and that your power relies on your physical strength, and that you can use that in terms of building it with other people. And I guess just thinking about how we build community, that when we begin to use these tools like racial justice and talking about race and using cultural practices, and when we begin to talk about gender and open up the space for people to talk about their own personal histories around gender, we have a great tool that we use called the gender autobiography, where people get a chance to map out all of the messages that they've learned about gender. Then people begin to see, like, oh, I get this and I understand how I'm impacted and how I want to live differently in the world, and how I can move away from this kind of negative stereotype that I feel pressure around, and I can determine who I want to be on my own terms. And that's the kind of engagement that moves people from being just constituents or direct service to actually building what we call political communities. So then you have people who are willing to fight with you, to be part of a movement, to bring their family members and their community members into the organization as part of the work. So for the journey, in terms of how I've got here, I mentioned at the beginning just some of the fancy letters that go after my name. But, you know, I often think of myself as being part of a missing generation, and that there are hundreds of thousands, even millions of other young people like me who shouldn't be here today. You know, they should be here today, but they aren't. And that what that means for me is that I mentioned this idea of like I'm a thriver. So, you know, I survive violence myself, and when I was 17 years old, I was abducted, and I was put into the trunk of a car, and I really thought that that would be the end, and I would never see my family again. And I managed to pull out the brake lights on the car, because I am a big fan of 9 to 5, which was a movie from the 80s with Dolly Parton in it, who is one of my personal heroes. And for those folks that know the movie, there's a scene in the movie where they have a short in the trunk, and they get pulled over by the police. And so I pulled out the brake lights and broke them. And as a result, the police did, in fact, pull over the car. And they, when I realized I could hear a police officer's voice, I had banged on the trunk and was rescued from the trunk of the car. And the person who took the car was someone who I'd known and trusted, and was someone I thought was a friend. And during that ordeal, so many things happened. I was assaulted, but what ended up happening was that I got to live, and I lived and became. That's how I became so strongly involved in the DV movement in California, and had an opportunity to travel around the country. I was on Oprah Winfrey to talk about what, not only my experience, but I think the opportunity for all of us to reshape the conversations around violence in our communities. And it was only many years later, when I went to grad school and began to really study gender, that I realized if we really want to change the ways in which violence shows up in our communities, we need to be talking about gender and having brave and courageous conversations with young people in particular very early on, so that we can transform the culture that they grow up in, one in which violence isn't permissible, and one in which we all have healthy tools at our disposal, whether they're communication tools or self-care tools, to really be able to take care of ourselves and each other. So I'm certainly, as I think about really being part of this missing generation, it also makes me think about all of those young people, right, who never made it out of the trunk of the car, who aren't here, and what untold dreams and solutions that have been lost to our world along with them. And in this work, I feel like I'm fighting not only for them, but I'm fighting for the opportunity to make sure that the generations to come are all here and able to contribute and build with us. So the last poll I have is really just around thinking about integrating and getting a sense of how many people right now feel like you have a working understanding of how to integrate some of the LGBT and LGBT-specific gender piece, because I know that that sometimes can be really challenging for folks to add in. So I wanted to get a sense if that's something that folks want, because I'll make sure that I get resources out to you all afterward if there's actually a need for it. Well, it definitely looks like that is a resource that could be helpful for folks. So I will make sure that I get that out, and I'm sure Lori can help me get it out to everybody after the webinar is over. So I know that I wanted to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and conversation at the end of the webinar, and just ways to plug in if you're like, oh my goodness, really ready to have more of this conversation. So the organization that I mentioned, the Brown Boi Project, they have a leadership development program. So if you have young men in particular that are young men of color that are part of your organization, they actually can apply to the leadership development retreats that the Brown Boi hosts. They host about 2 to 3 of them a year, and they hold them in California. But if you're young person applies and is accepted. So the person who would be kind of ideal for this, maybe you have someone who runs a young men's circle in your organization or is part of your outreach team, plays some role within your organization, maybe as a trainer, maybe as an advocate in the court, that they would be the perfect person to encourage to apply. And if they're accepted, the Brown Boi Project actually pays for the entire trip. There's no cost to the organization. So they fly them down to California. They put them up in a hotel. It's a little like a reality TV show. Everybody lives together for 5 days. But they have several hundred people apply every year to their leadership retreats, and then they choose about 18 to 20 participants who have an opportunity to be part of this really exciting and powerful conversation. They also get a chance to learn communications and fundraising and work on their own personal finances so they come back to your organization a much stronger leader in this work and in the movement, and really equipped to be able to help the organization start to have some of these conversations. In addition, there's technical assistance and training. Just yesterday, I was actually training an organization that has about 80 staff working with young people. They work with about 3,000 youth a year around LGBT issues specifically, but talking about gender, and really encouraging folks to think about who are the folks that have the least power or aren't at the table in these conversations in Alaska, and how you can help to raise the question of why they're not at the table and make sure that they are. So lastly, there's contact info there. If you're interested in getting more info about the Brown Boi Project, you can shoot an email over to info@brownboiproject.org and ask about their leadership retreats, and they can get you on their email list. The applications are coming out in January. And then if you're on Twitter, you can follow me at the Soap Butch. That's the best way to keep in touch with me and stay connected, and definitely excited and wanted to just open it up if there are questions or reflections or thoughts at this time from everybody.
So folks can either say your question if you want, or you can type them into the chat bar, and then one of us can read it if you prefer that route. So you can write it or speak your questions. Well, while people think of some of their questions, I'm sure people need a little chance to reflect. Cole, can you talk a little bit about, so on this call I think we have a lot of organizations that work in either public health or in domestic violence and sexual assault programs. I see some folks that work in the university setting and tribal health organizations. So I see kind of a range of folks, someone from CDC. But can you give us some places like, okay, if some of those folks that say, well, they're not really sure how to start integrating, let's see, how did you frame the question? About how to integrate and address LGBTQI gender issues in their programs or organizations. How do you start? And where do you start? And I know you're going to send out some additional resources, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think that one of the best places to start these conversations in general around gender is to have a brown bag lunch with the staff about how gender is showing up in the organization's work, because usually it's actually popping up already, but people don't know where to take that to and don't know how to bring kind of the question forward. But a lot of folks are struggling with it and have questions around it, and so even opening up the space for people to have that conversation is really, really powerful. I think that there can be a really great half hour to hour and a half 101 training around LGBT awareness that is really, really great. And there are organizations, I'm sure, that are based in Alaska that can help with that. But the resources that I will send around kind of cover some of the initial topics you want to think about are, how many LGBT families and individuals do we see or are we serving? And what are the unique barriers for those folks, so a lot of times they typically don't tend to come out because the costs and the stakes can be so high when you do come out. And a lot of our resources and tools that we produce in the DV movement typically tend to focus on just men and women, and often assume that men are going to be in the position of a batterer or a perpetrator of violence, and that women will be in the position of being a victim, or in some cases receiving some form of violence. And so I think that even just opening up our questionnaires is another really great place to start. I wanted to make sure to share CUAV is an organization. Their name is CUAV, and it's Communities United Against Violence, and they are actually the largest LGBT-specific organization in the country that works on issues of violence, and they have really great cards around intimate partner violence that we use with our LGBT youth and our straight youth to talk about what are the warning signs around when relationships move from being, concerning to actually in the territory of things that lead, like possessive and jealousy and violence. So it's a great resource for organizations to check out and peruse their website. They have some tools which can be a great intro, but those are a couple of ways that I think you can start the conversation.
I see another question there that I sent out to folks, that they're putting together a junior high presentation about gender identity, and asked if they could talk about your story to the group, and asked about your pronouns and those things.
Yeah, we'd be happy to. I know all of a sudden I was like in the middle of my story, and I was like, I wasn't planning to talk about this. But yes, I would be. That would be fantastic, and I think that there's still so few of us who feel comfortable talking about our experiences, and that just contributes to the overwhelming sense of isolation that happens with so many people that have survived violence. So yes, and my pronoun preferences are she, her, and sir.
She, her, and sir, is that what you just said?
Yes, I'd rather sir over ma'am any day of the week.
I see another question here about they're putting together a resource list, and I think it's to everyone, would anyone be able to include something for Two-Spirit or Native or Alaska Native LGBTQ folks? So I think that might be to everyone.
Yeah.
If anyone has any resources, please type them in the chat bar, and then I can send them out to everyone.
And I can definitely include some of the groups that I know nationally around the country that are doing Two-Spirit and Indigenous organizing. I'm part of a group in the Bay Area that's doing a lot of work. And then the Brown Boi Project actually in 2015 is planning to partner with NYLA, which is a national, it's a Native youth leadership. And so they work with youth that are in the tribal colleges all around the country. And so they're actually, the idea there is to do kind of a first ever youth leadership gathering for Native and Indigenous young people around the country. And so if folks email the info at Brown Boi Project email, then we'll make sure that they get plugged in, so that when the announcement for that gathering comes out, young people are able to apply to participate. There'll be significant scholarships so that it will make it fairly accessible for young people to get there no matter where it is.
Cool. I see another question here. I don't know if you can see them too, Cole, so I'm just reading them. It seems like your work with men and women in your work with men and women that it varies, the understanding of gender varies. Some knowing quite a bit and some not so much. What strategies do you use to diffuse the tension and get men and women to reflect on gender? And what are some of the things you introduce first?
Great question. So we really try to avoid like any jargon in the beginning. I think that unfortunately the nonprofit and public agencies, we love jargons and long acronyms, and that can be really hard when we're just trying to get people to think about their own personal experiences. So we always start with the personal experience. I mentioned an activity called a gender autobiography. So I'll tell you really quickly how to do it. You can all do it. It's one of our favorite opening ways to start the conversation. But basically you give people tons of art supplies and like an 8.5 by 11 paper. Sometimes we go with a larger 11 by 14 size paper, and give people space to reflect either with words or with pictures. We put magazines out so they can collage all of the earliest messages that they remember about gender, and that you give them about 15 minutes to work on it on their own, and then ask them to partner up with someone. And then they have an opportunity to really share deeply those experiences, and then come back into the larger group about like what are the ahas and the reflections that they took away from the process. And it opens up how much, how little we think about these issues, but at the same time how much they shape the way we think now. And that, I think, gives everyone, even if they haven't thought about this a lot, a real understanding that this is a big issue. It's much bigger than I thought. And that it has a much larger impact on me than I really thought. And then they become open to, okay, well, what do we do about it, and how do we think about it? There's a larger conversation around gender that's really important to have, like, well, everybody has a gender, and how is that different from sexual orientation for LGBT people? That's another great early conversation that we have. And there's a genderbread man that's floating around the internet. You all can Google it instead of a gingerbread man. He's a genderbread man. And it talks about the differences between gender expression, gender identity, and sexuality. And it's a great tool. We used to use the gender Gumby, but now none of our youth know who Gumby is anymore. So
it's outdated.
It's very outdated.
I see. Okay, cool. Well, that's great. Anything else you wanted to add to that question? That just like, how do you get started with that conversation, and what do you introduce first? What? Oh. I thought I heard someone, but okay. So anything else that you want to add around that question or answer?
No, just the genderbread person is really great as a resource. And I guess the other thing that I would add as you're thinking about having these conversations around gender is that another great early tool is actually to have people come up with a list around what makes somebody masculine and what makes someone feminine. And tends to be overwhelmingly pretty easy to make the list. Like I said, we all have very similar understandings of gender and gender norms, and that from those lists, you can see that culturally way more of the things that are on the list around femininity are seen culturally as negative than with masculinity. And there's a great book out there that I think would be a good resource for folks. And it specifically looks at gender and talks about girls, and it's called Odd Girl Out, ODD, Odd Girl Out, and it's by Rachel Simmons, and it basically talks about the hidden culture of aggression among girls and how this kind of queen bee, there are a lot of movies that have been made about it, but this notion is like the queen bee. I have a minute or two, so I'll just read. I just grabbed my copy. I'll read just a tiny little excerpt from it. But how there is this culture that girls are a big part of, but that all of us kind of contribute. And it's they do research with middle school girls, and they're interviewing all of these circles of girls. And she says that from periods 1 through 8, I heard the same responses. Girls can turn on you for anything, said one. Girls whisper, said another. They glare at you. With growing certainty, they fired out answers. Girls destroy you from the inside. Girls are manipulative. There's an aspect of evil in girls that there isn't in boys. Girls target you where they know you're weakest. Girls do a lot behind each other's backs. They plan and premeditate. In bold, matter-of-fact voices, girls describe themselves to me as disloyal, untrustworthy, and sneaky. They claim girls use intimacy to manipulate and overpower each other. They said girls are fake, using each other to move up the social hierarchy. And they describe girls as unforgiving and crafty. And the girls' stories about their
Terrible.
Yeah, they were casual and filled with self-hatred. And so it's interesting because she says girls tell stories of their anger in a culture that does not define their behaviors as aggression. As a result, their narratives are filled with destructive myths about the inherent duplicity of women. These things are seen more as kind of a coming of age that happens with girls as opposed to really interrupting these norms of violence that contribute to it. I often say that it's the same kind of anti-female, anti-feminine cultural sentiment that we have in our culture that allows mothers to hate their daughters-in-law. And it's the same, that's the same kind of framework that allows men to be violent towards women. It also encourages mothers to feel like there's no woman who will ever be good enough for their sons, but it's all part of the same negativity that we associate with women and with girls and with femininity. So there's tons of, it's a great book and is a good opening conversation. Even just that's from chapter 1. You could just read chapter 1 and get most of what you need from it to have a conversation about gender and how it's playing out in different places.
Great. I see there's one last question here that maybe we can use this last question because I'm sure want to end on time and thank everyone. But I think there's a question here about how, so you talked a little bit about domestic violence and sexual assault response work and that work maybe within the LGBTQ community. How, when you're thinking about primary prevention, do you think that there are important pieces that are different with doing primary prevention within the LGBTQ community, or does it differ than the rest of the primary prevention work and norm change work and stuff?
That's a great question. So I think that this is a huge opportunity for organizations and agencies that are on this call. Most LGBT organizations don't have tools and resources and capacity to really talk about violence in their work, despite the fact that, I was just doing some research that usually it's most agencies, LGBT organizations are working with 5 to 10% of the transgender population, but that they account for 70 to 80% of the violence, like hate crime violence, and in most communities, 90 to 100% of the murders. That young people who are LGBT are 2.5 times likely, young people of color, 2.5 times more to attempt or commit suicide. That there's a real need for the violence prevention tools that you all have, and you might partner with LGBT organizations, because I do think that the prevention work, the issue is that they don't come out. And so unless they come out, then you can't actually make the space for them to do the healing. But if they're already in LGBT organizations, you can bring your core expertise in domestic violence prevention into those organizations to be able to better serve those communities.
Great. Good. Well, I just want to make sure to see if there are any other questions that that folks have before we close today's web conference series. I see there's another one online here. It says, perhaps to be discussed later, but how do you deal with gender discussions with folks that base their beliefs around gender and cultural traditions? How do we rethink some of the things we learned as part of our culture while respecting cultural differences?
I love it. There's totally not time to answer that fully, but what I will say is that we've been doing a lot of work with faith-based communities where this question comes up a lot. And what I would just offer is that we actually have really complex understandings of gender, but we just don't tell them. Like, we know that there's like these stereotypes of hyper-masculinity in our communities, but we also know that we had grandfathers who like cooked and sewed and braided hair. And so we just actually have to give people more permission to tell the depth of their cultural traditions, because what we usually tend to find is that they actually have much more flexible gender norms than the ones, the stories, the main story, quote unquote, that people keep telling. So I would do the digging, but happy to, if folks want to hit me up on Twitter or through the Brown Boi Project, happy to engage that question even more.
Great. Okay. Well, I know we tried to answer a lot of little questions in a short amount of time, and I just want to thank you and let everyone know that this is recorded. So if you want to recap on something, we'll send the link out. And thanks so much to you, Cole, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone, for being here and participating.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. I see some thank yous online there. So
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Cole.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.